Welcome to Invisible, Breaking Through the Stigma of Addiction, and we are here in another wonderful episode. Today we have Steve Didham. Steve is a social worker from here in London, and we're super grateful to have you on the show, Steve.
I'm happy to be here, Dean. Thank you for having me.
I had the pleasure of meeting you through some mutual acquaintances and through Rick Cernick, who has also been on the show here, and we had the pleasure of having coffee a few months ago, and we just were able to just toss the ball back and forth, and it was pretty engaging, and we have a lot of similar ideas and thoughts about addiction. So I thought you were a perfect fit to come on the show today. So I appreciate you being here. Right out to start things off, what I was hoping is you could share a little bit about your work as a social worker, and then I understand Phoenix consulting and counseling is your business, and I would love for you to share a little bit about how that plays a role and why you might be on the show today.
All right, Dean. Well, thank you, and thanks for having me on the show. When you had asked me to come on, it was an immediate yes. So thank you. I launched Phoenix back in 2020, and it was I had been a social worker up until at that point for about 17, 18 years. But in 2020, I went through some kind of watershed changes in my life. And it kind of led me to begin to question some things that I had not questioned before. And as I started to do some of the deeper work and some deeper healing, Phoenix kind of started to become a vision. And it took about 2 years to kind of get it off the ground in terms of actualizing and really slowing down what the vision was from a micro to macro level. And as I started to, really get into the weeds of what this was going to look like, it took off in 2022, and it's been quite a ride since.
I understand that you help a plethora of individuals. Before the show started today, you said that you were doing some work specifically with helping men with specific issues. We don't have a lot of conversation around that and here on the show. The beauty of this is I know that you're also very well trained in diversity and recognizing all of those ideas of oppression and cultural concerns and stuff. But the idea of someone such as yourself focusing on men is also a wonderful idea to look at. So I would love to hear more about how you're helping men specifically.
Yeah, great question, Dean. So I'll start with a bit of a macro overview of what I do at Phoenix from the consulting and leadership lens.
Okay.
So it's equity, diversity, and inclusivity training and leadership training that I provide to organizations and the nonprofit sector specifically, and working with leaders and organizations and understanding the importance of identity and the identities that we carry, understanding the importance of social locations, that person in environment context, and how as organizations and why it's important for those organizations to embed that kind of understanding within their organizations and in their work with service recipients, the communities that they serve.
Sure.
So I started there specifically because the work with men that I do follows that lens around engaging with men, in my work with men, really kind of getting to know them at their deeper level, creating a safe environment for them to remove the masks that often men will carry in society around identity in terms of the social construct of what it is to be a man in our world today in terms of how we show up.
Yeah.
And so when I'm working with men, it's about, let's step away from that. Let's talk about who you are and doing some of the deeper work around what they've been socially conditioned in terms of how they see the world.
That's a really big topic, and I'm partial to it because I'm a man.
Yes.
But I recognize a big a struggle right now, and I don't know if it's the influence of media or social media, but there seems to be opposing male-female narratives transgender identity, things that are kind of really messing with the concept of being okay with being a man. Not only that, but the idea of those old social constructs of saying that you need to be a certain way, and then now society is counterintuitive to that. So there's a lot of struggles. So how would you work with an individual to overcome some of those identity struggles?
Well, it starts with, and I'm reminded of somebody that has heavily influenced the lens in which I see things, Dr. Ken Hardy, and he talks about seeing the self in relation to the other. So for me, it's about slowing it down and seeing the humanity within each other, seeing that we're actually kind of connected in terms of your well-being actually is connected to my well-being and vice versa. So when I'm working with men, it's about really slowing it down around who are they authentically and how do they know? And what layers of, unconscious trauma or an internalization of self might be happening at the surface level of their lives that may be problematic, that may be causing issues in whether it's interpersonal relations that they have or just in their life, in their environment. So really stripping away some of those social constructs of, for example, being tough, never crying, right? Not showing emotions, always being strong. Those were some of the things I certainly internalized within my life as well. So coming to terms with those as a male myself were really, really liberating, quite frankly, in terms of, no, it's actually okay to cry. It's okay to ask for help. It's okay not to be perfect, right? And so creating that environment, the relationship, that's the key piece, in my view anyhow, in terms of having those deeper discussions and really getting to the heart of how do I want to show up in the world? And what's my place in terms of my relationships with others and with myself?
So a sense of false beliefs, maybe a little bit of ego, some trauma, counterbalanced with compassion
100%.
for self and others.
That's a key piece, is for self. Because if you don't, from my perspective, if you're not compassionate with yourself, it may be very challenging for you to be compassionate with others. And so that's where we can start to see judgment happening, et cetera. So the self-compassion piece is a key part to that in terms of helping men or any of the clients that I'm working with, whether it's individuals or couples, really let go and lean away from perfectionism and begin to adopt a bit of a open mindset, leaning in, as Brene Brown says, to the discomfort of being vulnerable, of speaking your truth, even if it hurts, even if it's hard, even if it's uncomfortable.
So let's pair this up with the idea of the discomfort, the avoidance, the difficulties of the egocentric false beliefs, and let's pair this up with addiction and substance use.
Right.
What is that?
So from my perspective, and I know you and I are good friends with Dr. Cyrnic, who really helped me kind of understand addiction from a deeper biopsychosocial kind of context. But for me, the addiction, if there's substance use, et cetera, that's the surface level. That's the visible in terms of what we see at the surface. For me, it's about, let's get underneath that in terms of what's happening underneath that might be bringing about this manifestation of problematic behavior, if it's delving in that direction of substance overuse or an addiction. So it's about peeling back the layers and really being intentional in unearthing shame and guilt that we can, as humans, unconsciously carry, that can lead us to being inauthentic and holding in and repressing some of that stuff that then may surface as substance use.
So that surface is diamond tough.
It sure is. It sure
So,
is.
you know, I guess I would call myself a jackhammer then, you know, trying to working with addiction, and I'm not that aggressive. Don't get me wrong.
No, I know.
The concept is that with the work I do,
Yeah.
is I clearly recognize that the addiction is maladaptive coping, but we have to be able to come to some sort of acceptance and awareness to be able to get to any sort of deeper level, because that's a protective shroud, a coating that helps to protect them from getting into that deeper spots, which is all filled with all the icky, all the icky shame and the things that we don't like to talk about. So how does that work from your perspective to penetrate or get in there? Because I can't be vulnerable when I'm in survival mode, and that addiction is very survival mode based. How do you
Good question. So, the clients that I work with are at a stage in their awareness, right? In terms of their either pre-contemplative or they're at a stage where they're recognizing there might be a problem. So the approach is a little bit different when people are at that beginning level of kind of awareness. If folks are, you know, in pre-contemplative or in denial, it can be a bit more challenging, that surface, because boy, is it filled with shame? Is it filled with fear, avoidance? And then, of course, the addiction itself, if that's what's happening to the substance, to the distraction, right? And if it is something, whether it's pills, whether it's alcohol, there's that biological piece too that can be tricky. So there's multiple layers at that surface. So when you talk about the jackhammer, because there's just so many layers. For me, it's how do I create an environment where the person that I'm working with feels that I see their humanity?
Okay.
And really shedding and leaning into shedding perfectionism, shedding shame, to really begin to go deeper around what might be happening in here in terms of, what might be trauma, what might be an internalized, assaulted sense of self at the unconscious level.
The big T word comes up, trauma. I've had an experience in the past on several occasions, not personal, but I have other people's come to me with the experience of being in that contemplative state and, you know, tossing around, maybe I have a problem, maybe I don't have a problem, and then stepping into some sort of therapies that want to go right at the root of things, and they kind of overshoot what you just talked about, and it seems to sometimes cause relapse or, and I would love for you to just shed a little bit of light of, your reflection on that overshooting or trying to go right. I have people come to me and say, someone's trying to go right at my trauma, but I'm still in armor mode. And so maybe my analogy of a jackhammer was inappropriate, but that idea of maybe that being the jackhammer when it's not ready to be cracked yet, what impact do you think that would have on the person?
And so that's where I think we really have to get to know the human that we're working with, get to know that person. And when I'm working with individuals, I really slow it down to develop the relationship and get to know their humanity. So I will slowly and at their pace. So it's walking with, not pushing, not shoving, walking with.
No jackhammers.
Right? With compassion and with your own, showing up as your own authentic self as well.
Yes.
Right? So I bring a reflexive lens to this practice because my lived experience, I've got lots of education, which is very helpful, but the lived experience for me is where the magic is in terms of connection. Right. So for me, it's walking with that client and developing the relationship. So it is different. The path is different.
Amazing.
For everybody that I work with.
Yeah.
everybody. But it's about that constant walking with and checking in.
Awesome. So, person-centered approach, looking at the individual, knowing that they're all unique in their own way, showing up authentically myself to participate in that, and then the layers will come off in their own time. We're going to take a break. You also used you said lived experience. So
I did, indeed.
guess what we're going to talk about right after the break. We'll be right back with Steve Didham. Welcome back to Invisible: Breaking Through the Stigma of Addiction, where we're talking to Steve Didham. Steve, right before the break, you said the magic word, lived experience. That's something that I hold dear, and as most of the people who've seen the show know, I am also an individual with lived experience, and it's something that we celebrate here on this show. And I'm going to toss the ball back to you, and if you're comfortable with it, share a little bit about what that means to you and how you use it to help your clients.
Yeah, great question, Dean. So, I mentioned the word trauma a few times in the first part of or the first segment, and for me, a reflexive approach to this work as a therapist, as a social worker, I think is really, really critical to getting to know the humans that we're working with. How can we not bring our own humanity into the room? So for myself, I do have some lived experience with some intergenerational trauma, multi-generational trauma that really impacted me on an unconscious level for most of my life. So my trauma was really childhood trauma. And, we're learning so much more about neurodiversity and the impact of adverse childhood experiences. That resonates with me quite a bit because I can kind of apply it back to my own life around living in an environment of chaos, of trauma running the show, right? From two parents that loved at their level of love. However, their trauma was running the show in terms of chaos and addiction and domestic violence, and how that can kind of just blow up in a traumatic, in a unhealthy environment. So that upbringing, I internalized that, right, in my childhood. And even as I was going through education and understanding family systems theory, understanding trauma, it still didn't impact me on that deeper level, because that was my normal. And it wasn't until some significant changes in my life, as I mentioned earlier in 2020, where I began to peel away and began to question, why am I so hard on myself? Why is my internalized voice so full of shame? Right? At the surface level, you'd never know it, because I had figured out ways in which to adapt, to wear those masks, to show up and appear everything was fine. But in here, it wasn't. There was lots that was happening at that unconscious level. So I take that with and draw upon great wisdom in terms of the work, and in recognizing that although your experiences are definitely going to be different than mine, that's the wonderful part of this work, is every human that we work with is going to be different. What we are learning, though, is that we're really, when you strip away all the identities, you strip away the social locations and get to the humanity, trauma impacts us in similar ways. So I can take the healing that I have, the healing path that I am on, because it's not about a destination for me, the healing path that I'm on, and what wisdom, what magic of living that trauma and transmuting it into wisdom. What can I do with that to bring into the therapeutic environment in my work with individuals and with couples and with organizations as well? Because the other part is, and I think we're starting as a on a macro level, I think, to see this in a deeper way. just how much trauma is running the show in many ways.
So there is some juggling around this as we lean towards the understanding that there's a lot more to trauma to addiction than what we think.
Correct.
But some of the juggling is that people have this concept or idea that trauma is just a single solitary one impacted event. I had a trauma, I have shell shock, I was in a car accident,
Right.
I had sexual assault or something like that gave me trauma. But when you're referring to complex trauma or things that happened over periods of time or intergenerational, which leads to that complex trauma, it changes who we are as a person, which is a little different, right?
Yes.
The interesting part that I want to reflect on a little bit is the idea of knowledge and education of that, but still not doing the work, because I spend every day talking with these wonderful, beautiful, intelligent individuals that know how to read a book, but they can't process, right? So what I would love for you to reflect on a little bit is the difference between intellectualization and knowledge versus
Oh man.
doing the stuff, which is day and night. So how do we reflect on that? It's a big question. We don't have time for the whole answer, but what's your, how do you get to it?
One of the metaphors I use both into the counseling and in the consulting work that I do is connecting head to heart, right? The cognitive intelligence that we carry, connecting it to our emotional intelligence. And when we talk about emotional intelligence, really getting into the pillars of what does that mean? Because it's not just about, holding hands and singing Kumbaya and self-love, right?
Yeah.
It's also about self-accountability, self-responsibility, right? Recognizing how your behavior is impacting others and leaning into understanding if it's causing harm, thinking on that a little bit in terms of, is there a shift or is there a growth that may be needed in certain areas? So for me, it's connecting head to heart and really helping folks to understand how trauma manifests, how ego can really, really get in the way of the work. Right. And if we are, and you mentioned it earlier, stuck in a bit of a frozen state within our trauma, stuck in a survival mode, it really can create barriers of connecting the head to the heart.
Accountability.
Yes.
Such a difficult thing because we're dealing with emotional people that don't like their own emotions.
Right.
And giving them some accountability sometimes makes them want to flip the table. So there's a healthy ways to help people to focus on accountability, because a lot of addiction is the absence of that accountability. That's how I cope, is by just ignoring that.
That's right.
Are there softer, easier ways to help individuals? And if people listening at home, they might want to look at their own accountability in a different way. What would you say?
Definitely through a lens of compassion and love, quite frankly, self-love, in terms of this is not about dehumanizing somebody. This is actually supposed to be about humanizing them and normalizing the human experience, because those kinds of behaviors are really manifestations of deeper things that are at play. So if we can have that trauma-informed, compassionate lens, we can talk about accountability in a different way. And it's going to be different for every person based on their level of awareness to their own lives, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I'm going to ask a big ask of you.
Yes, of course.
There is one of the largest hurdles that individuals have in finding that ability to have compassion for themselves and others is the people around them and the environment, and the misunderstanding of addiction and them being able to not move forward because the people around them are saying, just do it, or just be different, or you shouldn't be this way, or whatever. Like, they're contributing to that shame and like the title of the show, the stigma that comes from that. If you could share something on how, because we have a lot of family members that watch this show to try and help better understand their loved one, how would you reflect towards a loved one and how they could help the person that's struggling with addiction in that accountability?
That's a really good question. I'm going to speak to my own lived experience with addiction to answer that, because for me, trauma ran my life unconsciously in certain areas of my life for a long time. So while I was, I think always a good person, trauma sometimes got in the way. And one of the ways that it did was an opiate addiction that I experienced almost 10 years ago. And I'll tell you, Dean, during that period of time, it was covert, and shame was running the show in terms of trying to keep that under wraps. But even as I stepped into and leaned into recovery, shame was something that held me back from even talking about my own lived experience. And I prefaced the answer to your question with that because I think it's really important that, again, for family and friends that are watching this show that have loved ones that they're worried about or that they know is actively struggling, compassion is really going to be really important, because I believe that people that are struggling with addiction are not doing so by choice, right? They're not choosing to be in this state of chaos within their lives. So the very thing that they do not need is more shame and more kind of power over approaches that kind of dehumanize them. Accountability is important. Safety is important. So it's a really complex approach, but more than anything, creating space for folks that are struggling to feel love, feel support, feel that they matter, I think is really critical, because that held me back for a long, long time.
So to wrap things up, Steve Didham on the show today, and compassion being the undertone of it all. We can set boundaries and be assertive and do the things that we need to do to ask for accountability of our loved ones, but I can also be compassionate at the same time without being a doormat, and I can be loving and understand that there's suffering going on there at the same time. So that's it for today. Thanks, Steve, for being on the show. Thank you, everybody, for watching Invisible, Breaking Through the Stigma of Addiction, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.